The town that erased its black history. Chapter 1. A map with missing streets. When I was a kid, my grandfather kept an old map of the town rolled up in the top drawer of his desk. It was faded, browned at the edges, and torn in places, but it was full of names, street names, park names, names of churches, schools, corner stores, all carefully inked in with a fountain pen. He'd unroll it on the kitchen table like it was a treasure map, pointing to places I never saw on the printed maps they gave us in school. "That was Lincoln Row," he'd say. "And over here was Carver Street. That's where your aunt was born. And over here, Brown's Chapel, burned down twice, never rebuilt." But when I looked at the town's official map, online, in brochures, even the one that hung in the mayor's office, those names were gone. Not renamed, not preserved. Gone. Entire streets that once bustled with black families, black businesses, black churches, erased. The town grew. Shiny new developments popped up. But in all that expansion, they seemed to forget what was already there. Or maybe it wasn't forgetting at all. Maybe it was something more intentional. I walked the streets one summer, retracing the map from my grandfather's memory. What was once Lincoln Row was now a paved-over dead end behind a shopping plaza. Carver Street was a gravel alley with no sign. Brown's Chapel, a parking lot for the courthouse. Neighbors remembered, but only in hushed tones. "Don't stir things up," one old man warned. "That's just the way things go around here." But I couldn't unsee it. Every time I walked to school, to the library, to the bus stop, I saw what wasn't there. Ghosts of a community that had been carefully painted over, first with silence, then with concrete. That map in my grandfather's drawer, it became the only record of a version of this town that once made space for people like me. And it told a story the new maps refused to share. Chapter 2. The statue that was quietly removed. It happened over a weekend. No news article, no public notice, no ribbon cutting or town hall vote. Just gone. The statue had stood for decades at the edge of a grassy square near the old courthouse. Not grand, not towering, but important. It was of Charles Bernard, a formerly enslaved man who became the town's first black alderman in 1908. He wore a worn coat, one hand resting on a ledger book, the other tucked behind his back. People passed it daily, some barely noticing it, others nodding with respect. My grandmother used to bring me there after church. She'd lay a flower at its base every year on Juneteenth. "He helped build this town," she'd say. "They want you to forget that." And they did. One Saturday morning, I passed by and it was there. That Monday afternoon, it wasn't. Just an empty brick pedestal and some grass still pressed from where the base used to sit. I asked around. No one knew, or no one wanted to say. The city clerk shrugged. The mayor's assistant mumbled something about renovations, but there were no new blueprints, no work crews, no announcements about where it had gone. The local paper never mentioned it. The town newsletter skipped straight from park updates to pet adoption stats. But people noticed. Quietly. In barber shops. In living rooms. Online. A photo circulated briefly. A blurry image of the statue loaded onto a flatbed truck under cover of darkness. Gone. They said it was being preserved. Said it was in storage, said it would be relocated, but it never came back. a piece of our past, tangible, visible, removed without ceremony, without truth. And what do you call it when history vanishes silently? Erasure by design. Chapter 3. The school books that skipped the truth. We opened our textbooks to Chapter 6, the founding of the town. There was a photo of the first mayor, a long paragraph about the early merchants, and a note about the old train depot that had been turned into a museum. But there was no mention of the black families who built the rail lines, no names of the freedmen who opened the first barbershops and cafes in what used to be called Freeman's Square. Not a single word about the Reconstruction-era violence that reshaped entire neighborhoods. Nothing about the burning of Brown's Chapel. Nothing about Charles Bernard. Not even a footnote. I raised my hand once to ask about it. My teacher, kind but visibly uncomfortable, said, "We'll get to that later." But we never did. In the library, I found an older textbook, copyright 1982. Inside, there were black and white photos of a parade celebrating the desegregation of the high school, a grainy image of the Negro League baseball team that once played at Kennedy Park, pages that were missing from the newer editions. When I brought it up to the school board, they smiled politely. "We align with the state curriculum," they said. "There's just not enough room for everything." But there was room for the annual reenactment of the Pioneer Festival. Room for 3 chapters on Civil War generals who never set foot in our state. Room for photos of brick buildings funded by businesses that once refused to serve black customers. It wasn't just what they left out, it was what they chose to remember instead. And that silence, printed, bound, and distributed, was louder than any erasure I'd seen on a map or in a statue's removal. Because this wasn't forgetting. This was curriculum. Chapter 4. The Church That Burned Twice. They rebuilt it once, thinking that would be enough. The first time Brown's Chapel burned, it was 1963. My great-grandmother used to sing in the choir there. She remembered the smoke, the ash, the water lines on the stone walls after the firemen left. Nobody was ever arrested. They called it an accident. Faulty wiring, they claimed, though the building had just passed inspection the week before. But people knew. They always did. The congregation rebuilt with whatever they had, bricks donated from nearby towns, hand-me-down pews, windows without glass. They gathered anyway, sang louder, prayed harder. Then, in 1979, it burned again. This time, in the middle of the night. No electrical excuse, just a smoldering wreck by morning. No arrests again, just murmurs, whispers, and again, silence. I stood at the lot, decades later, nothing left but a plaque, half covered by overgrown grass. Most people passed it without a glance. A few knew the name. Fewer remembered the pain. What struck me most wasn't that it happened. It was how little space it occupied in our town's memory. No photos in the museum, no mention in the school book timeline, no public day of remembrance. Just gone. But when I spoke to Mrs. Holloway, 90 years old and still sharp, her voice cracked as she recalled standing in a pewless chapel with smoke still clinging to the rafters, singing, "We shall not be moved." "Twice," she said, "they tried to burn us out twice. But we kept coming, because church ain't the building, it's the people." Still, they never rebuilt after the second time. The congregation scattered, the name faded, and the town built a strip mall 2 blocks over, as if that was the story that mattered more. Some scars heal, others are paved over. Chapter 5. When old photos went missing. It started with the library wall. There used to be a display of photographs lining the back hallway. Black and white images, some sepia-toned, all framed and neatly labeled. They showed the town as it once was. Parades down Main Street, the old high school before renovation, church gatherings, and community picnics in Freeman's Park. But one day, without warning, the photos changed. The display was updated with a modern look at our past. Same hallway, new photos, all in color, all recent. Ribbon cuttings, new buildings, politicians posing with smiling residents. There were no black faces, no old parades, no church gatherings in front of Brown's Chapel. Nothing from the early days that I remembered seeing before. I asked the librarian, Miss Reed, what happened to the originals. She paused, then said, "They're in the archives now." We had to rotate the collection, but when I checked the archives catalog, they weren't listed. I asked again. She said they were being digitized. A few weeks later, I checked again. Still gone. I visited the library after school every day that week. I asked for Miss Reed again, but she was suddenly unavailable. A younger librarian told me they were reorganizing the archival space. I offered to volunteer. They politely declined. Later, I met with my aunt. She pulled out an old photo album with a familiar image, the same one that had once hung in the hallway. Her father, standing beside a mule cart during a protest march in the 60s. That photo was the only proof, she said, that he stood for something. Proof matters, not just to families, but to history. I made copies. I visited other elders in town. More photos emerged. School events, church choirs, sit-ins, parades. Most of them never seen outside of private homes. Most of them, like our history, never invited into the public eye. Then I did something risky. I made my own display. I printed the images, typed out labels, and one Saturday morning, I pinned them to a bulletin board just outside the library's main hallway. I called it "What They Took Down." It lasted 3 days. Someone tore the photos down and left a note. Unauthorized materials will be removed. But by then, people had seen it. Some took pictures. A local pastor printed a few and hung them in his church lobby. A teacher emailed me asking if I could come speak to her class. What they tried to erase had already started to return. But the fact remains, it wasn't an accident. It was a slow, quiet clearing of a wall. A gentle, calculated replacement of the uncomfortable with the palatable. They didn't set fire to the evidence. They simply filed it into non-existence. And what's worse than being erased? Being replaced and told you never existed. Chapter 6. The street names that suddenly changed. It started with small signs, literally. One morning, Oak Street had become Heritage Lane. The next, Jefferson Avenue was now Patriot Way. Familiar corners were suddenly unrecognizable, not because the roads had shifted, but because the names had. No press release, no community input, no vote. Just quiet swaps. I grew up on Booker Avenue. The sign hung rusted, the paint chipping, but it carried weight. It was named after Booker T. Washington, and the entire street was once the spine of the black community. Barbershops, a corner store, 2 churches, and the old Booker Elementary School, which had been shuttered for years. One day I passed by and the new sign read Bluebird Drive. Just like that. I asked around. The city said it was part of a beautification effort, that old names didn't reflect the town's evolving image. But it wasn't just cosmetic. They weren't replacing broken signs, they were replacing memory. I pulled records, dozens of changes over 3 years, names like Douglas Street, Harriet Lane, and MLK Circle, gone, replaced with nature themes, generic landmarks, and patriotic slogans. It was like someone was sanding down the edges of a story they didn't want told. I met a man named Reggie, who used to run the old barber shop on what was once Frederick Street. He pulled out a photograph of his shop with the original sign above the door. You see that? That name meant something. Now my grandkids think it was always Fieldstone Place. But Reggie wasn't the only one. I visited Miss Gloria, who remembered when Langston Court was a hub for jazz musicians passing through town. She told me how, as a child, she'd sneak onto her rooftop just to hear saxophones echo off the buildings. That street was now Larkspur Lane. Even the community center, once named after a local civil rights organizer, Ella Mason, had been renamed. Now it was the Pines Wellness Pavilion, a modern name for a building with walls that had once sheltered protest meetings, taught literacy classes, and hosted funeral services when the churches were full. I hosted a small event, unofficial of course. We printed the original names and taped them below the new ones, just for a weekend. Booker Avenue, beneath Bluebird Drive. Frederick Street beneath Fieldstone Place. Harriet Lane beneath Harvest Way. Some were torn down before sunset, others stayed till Monday morning. A few cars honked in support. Others drove by and stared, confused. It wasn't just about pride, it was about proof. Street signs are history carved in steel, and in this town, they were being rewritten without consent, one pole at a time. Each sign removed wasn't just a name lost, it was a story severed. It was a place where someone's grandmother was born, where someone's father opened his first business, where children once skipped rope and sang songs passed down through generations. Names matter, because if you can rename a street, you can reshape a story. And if no one remembers what came before, who's left to say it mattered? Chapter 7. The librarian who asked too many questions. Her name was Ava Monroe. Mid-50s, thin silver streaks in her braids, always wore a cardigan with pens tucked into the sleeves. Ava wasn't from here, moved to town about 10 years back. But she had a gift for finding stories in silence. At first, no one noticed the questions. She'd file a form to request an old town directory, dig through dusty boxes in the back room marked miscellaneous, or ask about names that didn't match street signs anymore. A historian by instinct, a librarian by trade. It changed when she started asking out loud. She created a display for Black History Month, not the usual national figures, but local ones. Charles Bernard, the 1968 protest outside the old high school, a handwritten sermon from the last pastor at Brown's Chapel. Ava even tracked down yearbook photos showing the desegregation of the public pool. The board called it too political. The next month, she organized a reading series on erased voices. Attendance was strong. The following week, her access to archival records was suddenly under review, and she didn't stop. She spoke at a town meeting, not with anger but clarity. She listed facts, dates, names, gaps in the museum, discrepancies in the town's commemorative plaques. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Some attendees clapped. Others didn't look up from their phones. Weeks later, her position was restructured, her hours reduced, her access to the archives revoked. Eventually she left. No goodbye party, no tribute in the newsletter. But the wall where her display had been? It stayed empty for months. Some people called her a troublemaker, others a savior. I just call her the first person who asked the right questions. And maybe that's why they wanted her gone. Chapter 8. A History Museum Without Us. The first time I walked into the town's history museum, I expected to feel something familiar, some thread that tied me to the place I'd lived my whole life. What I got was silence. The exhibits were tidy, well-lit and impressively curated. They displayed vintage railroad signs, a model of the original courthouse, and portraits of early settlers with brass plaques beneath their names. But none of the names looked like mine. None of the faces had skin that matched my own. There was a whole wing on the lumber industry, another on local sports teams. One room recreated an old apothecary in stunning detail. But when I looked for something, anything about the town's black history, there was only a single panel, a black and white photo of students during early school integration. No names, no context. I asked the docent where the rest of it was. She gave me a polite smile and said, "We're working on expanding that section." That was 5 years ago. Since then, they'd added an entire exhibit on antique tractors. I asked to speak with the museum director. He walked me through the archives, a back room lined with file boxes. "We have more," he admitted, "but it's sensitive material." Sensitive? How is a church burning down twice sensitive? How is a community's disappearance from public record sensitive? The truth is, they had the stories, the photos, the records, but they didn't have the will, because telling the full history meant telling an uncomfortable one. It meant admitting the town didn't just forget, it chose to forget. And so the museum stood there, shiny and proud, a place where we were invisible by design. A museum without us isn't history. It's fiction polished in glass. Chapter 9. The Elder Who Remembered Everything. Her name was Mrs. Etta Lane. She lived 3 blocks from the elementary school, in the last house on Sycamore Drive that still had its original paint and porch swing. She was 97 the first time I knocked on her door with a notebook in my hand. I told her I was collecting stories. She said, "Child, I've got more than you can carry." She didn't speak quickly. She spoke with weight, as if every memory had to climb its way out through decades of silence and being ignored. She remembered when Freeman's Park was a picnic ground for colored families only, before they paved half of it for a dog park. She remembered Brown's Chapel, both times it burned. She remembered the night the train depot refused to let her uncle board, even though he'd built the platform himself. She remembered Charles Bernard's funeral and how the city refused to lower the flag. She had photo albums stacked in boxes, tied with ribbon. She kept clippings, weddings, births, deaths, from a newspaper that stopped printing black announcements in the 80s. She had names that no longer appeared in school rosters, on street signs, or in museum exhibits. "I don't forget," she said, "because when you forget, they win." She wasn't bitter. She was tired, but determined. She offered tea, told stories like sermons. She showed me where the old Booker School's foundation still poked up through the grass. And when I asked if I could record her, she said, "You better, otherwise they'll pretend none of us were ever here." Mrs. Lane was more than memory. She was resistance in human form. And while the town had scraped names off signs and erased photos from library walls, she carried it all in her chest. Her voice was the archive, and I wasn't about to let that vanish too. Chapter 10. The town hall meeting no one was told about. It was supposed to be a formality. Buried in the middle of the town's website, just below updates about mosquito spraying and above the announcement for the pie-eating contest, was a notice. Town hall meeting, Thursday, 7 p.m. No flyers, no robocalls, no Facebook post from the mayor's office. Just a digital whisper. The meeting was about zoning and redevelopment, at least. That's what the listing said. But when a friend tipped me off and I walked in that night, I realized what it really was. A plan to rezone what was left of the black side of town. Only about 20 people were in the room, most of them city staff or business leaders. The presentation was slick. Maps, PowerPoint slides, terms like revitalization, streamlining, and opportunity zones. But I saw it for what it was, an erasure dressed up in graphs. They talked about new housing developments, retail spaces, and tax incentives. What they didn't talk about were the families that still lived there, the churches still holding Sunday service, the corner stores where generations had gathered. They never said the word displacement. One older man stood up during the brief Q&A and asked if current residents had been consulted. The presenter smiled and said, "We sent out surveys. No one I knew received one." Another woman asked if there was an impact report. "Everything has been reviewed," the presenter said smoothly, but he couldn't name a single resident by name, couldn't name the church on Booker Avenue, couldn't tell you where the old rec center stood. I watched as hands raised with questions were ignored in favor of moving to the next slide. And when one local tried to read aloud a list of families who would be forced out, his microphone was cut due to time. By the end of the hour, the plan was unanimously approved. The board clapped, the room emptied, and the map, our map, changed again. Outside, a few of us lingered on the steps. No chants, no signs, just shared silence and the weight of knowing we'd been written out without ever being named. The next morning, the newspaper ran a headline, "New plan paves the way for growth." There was no mention of the vote, no mention of the voices that tried to be heard. That's how it happens. Not with bulldozers. With silence, with meetings no one was told about, and with stories no one writes down. Chapter 11. Paint over the past. It started with the mural on the side of Booker Elementary. It had been there since before I was born, painted in the ATS by a group of students and community elders. It showed the history of the black neighborhood. A jazz musician blowing his horn under a lamplight, Charles Bernard speaking to a crowd, children running through Freeman's Park, and Brown's Chapel rising strong despite the smoke that once tried to bring it down. I used to pass it every day walking home from school, faded, cracked in spots, but full of life. It was the only public art in town that reflected the story I grew up hearing in kitchens and church pews. Then one day, it was gone. A fresh coat of beige, clean, plain, no community notice, no restoration effort, just gone. As if someone walked by and decided the past no longer deserved a wall. When I called City Hall, they said it was part of a beautification initiative, said they were cleaning up unsanctioned murals. But that mural had been funded by the city's own arts grant. Years ago, sure, but officially, documented. I asked if there were plans to repaint it. They said no. We're exploring new visions, they told me. Something that reflects the whole town. But it had reflected the whole town, just not the part they wanted to see. A few days later, someone taped a photo of the original mural to the wall. It fluttered in the wind until it was gone too. Paint doesn't just cover bricks. It covers memory. It silences color. And in this town, it was a brush dipped in denial. That wall used to speak. Now it says nothing at all. Chapter 12, When Graves Were Relocated. They called it cemetery modernization. A few dry paragraphs in the town bulletin explained that the old Eastview Cemetery, established in 1892, would be relocated to accommodate expansion and ensure long-term care. They used words like efficiency, upkeep, and accessibility. They didn't mention that it was a historically black cemetery. They didn't mention that Charles Bernard was buried there. They didn't mention that the land was once donated by freedmen who carved headstones with their bare hands. When I drove by one afternoon, the gate was chained. A bulldozer sat idle beside a mound of dirt. The sign had been removed. The wooden arch that once welcomed visitors had been knocked down. I asked City Hall where the graves were going. A staffer chewing on a pen said, "Don't worry, they'll be handled respectfully." When I asked about the names, the headstones, the family plots, he shrugged. Records are spotty. But my aunt still had the funeral programs, my neighbors still had the deeds, my cousin remembered planting roses beside her grandfather's grave. We remembered. They didn't. The next month, I found a new sign posted on the old cemetery gate. Future site of Town Cultural Pavilion. Culture built on graves. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement, just men in orange vests, quietly digging up what they never cared to understand. Some headstones never made it to the new site. Some bones were boxed without names. You can move a grave, but what happens to the history rooted in that soil? They said they were preserving legacy, but they were really just making space. Chapter 13, The Classroom, where no one spoke up. It was the third week of February, and the teacher had just announced the class would be doing presentations for Black History Month. Pick a figure, she said. Do some research, make it creative. The whiteboard listed names: Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Barack Obama. Great names, powerful names, but no mention of Charles Bernard. No local history, no invitation to explore the roots that ran right beneath the school building we sat in. I raised my hand. Can we do someone from town history? She hesitated. Well, the assignment is national figures, but I suppose that's okay. So I chose Charles Bernard. I spent a week digging, interviewing Mrs. Etta Lane, visiting the overgrown graveyard, scanning library archives. I printed out copies of the only known photo I could find, wrote every detail I could gather. When it was my turn to present, I spoke with pride. Told them he had been the town's first black alderman. Told them he fought to keep the school open when it was first threatened with closure in the 1920s. Told them he built coal stoves with his own hands to keep classrooms warm when the city wouldn't send supplies. When I finished, the room was silent. Not from awe, from discomfort. The teacher nodded and moved on. Thank you. Okay, next we have Thomas Jefferson. No questions, no claps, no comments. After class, one student said quietly, "I didn't know that about this town." Another said, "You sure he was real?" I wanted to scream, but instead I just walked out, holding my photo printout like a flag no one wanted to salute. That classroom didn't deny history, it just didn't make room for it. Chapter 14. The parade that changed its route. Every year on Founders Day, the town hosts a parade. It starts downtown, winds through the courthouse square, and used to march right past Booker Avenue, what was once the heart of the black neighborhood. I remember standing with my cousins on the porch, waving at the marching band as they passed by. We'd set out folding chairs early and bring drinks in coolers. It wasn't just tradition, it was presence. It was proof that we were part of the town's heartbeat. But one year, the route changed. No reason given, just a new map posted online showing a shorter path that veered west, away from Booker Avenue, away from us. I called the Parks and Events office. The woman on the phone said the change was due to logistics, something about road closures and safety, but the roads were fine. They always had been. That year, the parade passed through the new Heritage District, past condos and boutiques. The float celebrating the town's founding rolled down roads once renamed to forget us. The sound of drums never reached our block. Some families still set up chairs out of habit. A few kids held little flags, waiting for something that never came. One little girl asked her grandma, "Did we miss it?" "No, baby," she whispered. "They just didn't come this way this time." But we knew it wasn't just this time. That change stayed. And so the parade carried on. Flags waving, candy flying, history marching to a beat that deliberately skipped the street where so much of it had been built. They didn't just reroute a parade. They rerouted recognition and called it progress. Chapter 15. The mural that brought it all back. It started with a blank wall. The side of the old pharmacy building, 3 stories high, weathered brick, once covered in graffiti and forgotten notices. For years, it stood in silence, a canvas waiting for someone to remember. Then, one summer, the wall changed. It began with a sketch, a faint outline of a face. Then another, and another. Within weeks, color exploded across the bricks. Charles Bernard mid-speech, Mrs. Holloway standing strong outside Brown's Chapel, a child holding a sign that read, "I am my ancestors' dream." No one claimed it at first. No ribbon cutting, no name attached. Just paint, layered with purpose. The town took notice. Some complained. It's too political, they said. Too confrontational. But others gathered. They brought folding chairs and coolers, just like during the parades that used to pass Booker Avenue. They watched as the faces of the erased re-emerged, one brushstroke at a time. I found out later it was painted by a group of young local artists. Black, brown, queer, immigrant, guided by stories passed down from their grandparents. Stories they had kept alive in journals and dinner table conversations because they knew the town wouldn't. The mural stretched across the entire wall by summer's end. It included the names of streets that no longer existed, the church that burned twice, and the parade that stopped marching. Underneath it all, in bold, looping script, "We were here. We are here. We're not leaving." And for the first time, people stopped, looked up, asked questions. School buses paused so teachers could explain who Charles Bernard was. Tourists took photos and asked what Freeman's Park used to be. Families stood in silence, tracing the painted faces of their own ancestors with their eyes. The mural became more than paint. It became a place to gather, a spot where vigils were held, where elders told stories, where children asked questions they never dared to before. People began leaving flowers beneath it, notes, names of others lost to silence. Someone pinned a copy of the town's old map to a corner of the wall, marking the missing streets. The mayor never spoke about it officially, but city workers stopped scrubbing the sidewalk beneath it. The mural remained untouched. It was as though the wall itself had demanded to be left alone, finally given the dignity it deserved. And in a town that spent decades painting over its past, this wall shouted louder than silence ever could. It didn't just bring the past back, it dared the future to remember.